am excited to talk about today's deck because it combines some of my favorite types of strategies in Magic. I love artifact decks, it's what I play in Modern, and I adore aristocrat style strategies. And one of my favorite mechanics, because when I was a kid, this was one of the cheapest things I could afford, is Affinity. And this deck combines all of that together into one package. My only complaint is that the commander doesn't have green in it, but if that was not the case, then this would be a perfect commander. Otherwise, let's talk about today's commander, Imskir Iron Eater. So this card is fantastic. It is an 8-mana commander, which may turn you off immediately, but don't worry, that is not going to matter when we are done. The entire point of this deck is to get lots of artifacts on the board as quickly as possible, and then use them as part of an engine to burn opponents to death. Let's go ahead and get into what we're going to be doing with Imskir Iron Eater. Imskir is an 8-mana legendary demon with 5/5. He's got affinity for artifacts, which means that every single artifact on your board will contribute to lowering his cost by 1, and that includes command tax. He also says when you enter the battlefield, he draws you X cards and then you lose X life, where X is half the number of artifacts you have rounded down. Then he's got a Haymaker ability, which is what we're building the deck around primarily, where he can deal damage equal to the sacrificed artifact that he throws away for 4 mana to any target. That includes creatures, but primarily we're going to be aiming this at people's noggins. We're going to be making enemies throughout our game, and that is a-okay, because no matter how many times they kill Imskir, we're just going to have enough artifacts to pay for them over and over and over again. So, like I said, this is going to be an artifact aristocrat strategy where most of our game plan is going to revolve around quickly throwing a bunch of artifacts on the board and then incrementally burning people to death with what those artifacts are doing. To start out, we've got a couple of big artifacts we need to talk about in this deck that are going to be doing a lot of work for us. The first one is Mere Battlesphere, a just very, very commonly used card in lots of artifact strategies. When it enters the battlefield, put 4 1/1 colorless mirror on the battlefield, and if it attacks, you can tap X untapped mirror to get XO onto the battlefield, and then it will burn somebody or a planeswalker they have for however much you tapped into it. So Mirror Battlesphere is a really cool card in decks that can recur it or blink it. In our deck, you play it, and then it discounts our commander's cost by 5 automatically, which is already really good. But we can combine that by swinging the Mirror Battlesphere at somebody, getting that burn effect immediately, burning them for 4, and then using our commander to throw the Mirror Battlesphere at them, causing a grand total of 11 damage every single time we use the Battlesphere for this effect. And anytime we reanimate the Battlesphere, subsequent Battlespheres will always burn for more and also discount our commander for more. In the same vein, Threefold Gearhulk is doing a lot of the same work. Comes into play with 3 1/1 counters, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a 1/1 gnome artifact for every token, or for every 1/1 counter that's on it, basically, for however much power the Threefold Thunderhulk has. We can also sack artifacts with it, so it is another card we can use as a sack outlet to put a 1/1 counter on it, so we can generate even more gnomes with it. Threefold Thunderhulk is a house if you can actually get him on the board, but with all those tokens, we need to actually have a way to punish people and hurt their life totals. So we have 4 cards here in our artifacts, our hurt section, beginning with Agent of the Iron Throne. This card says if an artifact or creature we control hits the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. This is the incremental way we have of lowering people's life, whereas our commander and stuff like Mirror Battlesphere will be the chunky way to lower people's life. Psychomancer can also give you the same effect as Agent of the Iron Throne while being an artifact creature, so it is easier to recur in our deck. Whenever it or another non-token artifact is put into the graveyard, then you get to make each opponent lose 1 life, and you gain 1 life. And that 1 life we are gaining is important because Imskir does burn us for the draw. Then we have Dowsing Device, which gives a creature 1/0 and haste when it enters the battlefield, but that's not the main reason it's here. If we have 4 or more artifacts, it'll automatically flip into this Geode Grotto, which says until end of turn, a creature gains haste and then gains XO, where X is the number of artifacts we control. This card allows us to do things like play the Mere Battlesphere and automatically grant it haste with the Geode Grotto, and then punch somebody for a lot of damage with the Battlesphere, and then sack the Battlesphere after the effect instead. Also, because cards like Threefold Thunderhulk want to enter the battlefield and attack, this can be used to guarantee that we get 6 gnome tokens immediately before sacrificing these cards to our commander's effect. Geode Grotto is amazing, and it does a lot of work in any aggro-based artifact deck, which we have a little bit of in here. Then we have the Sunshot Militia, which lets us tap 2 untapped artifacts or creatures to deal 1 damage to each opponent at sorcery speed. This is another way to benefit from the plethora of artifact tokens we will be generating with cards like Threefold Thunderhulk and Mere Battlesphere. But a deck will not work if we just make tokens and try to burn. We've got lots of other ways we need to burn our opponent as well. Not just the small stuff, we need to talk about some of the big stuff. Let's talk about some of our big sack outlet dudes. This is Barricade Breaker. It has improvise, so our artifacts can tap to pay for its mana value. And while it attacks each combat if able, that's not why it's here. This just says, burn a thing for 7 with our commander. We play it essentially for free and then throw it at somebody's throat. Then we have Metalwork Colossus, which is doing much of the same work. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of all of our non-creature artifacts. As we have 49 artifacts in the deck with only 24 of them being creatures, this card is going to see a lot of cards. All of our mana rocks basically will pay for this without even tapping them. This also lets us sack 2 artifacts, so it is a sack outlet as well while in the graveyard to return it to our hand. So we, if we have enough mana, can just play this, burn somebody for 11, and then repeatedly play it over and over and over again until we run out of mana, burning somebody to death. And we have ways of getting huge mana in this deck, which you'll see here in a bit. Then we have Sojourner's Companion, which can artifact land cycle to get us one of our artifact lands if we want it to, but also it is a 7 mana affinity for artifacts creature, meaning it is essentially free in our deck and also has the ability to just be thrown at somebody for 7 damage. Furnace Hellkite also can be thrown for 7 damage, but it has a fire-breathing effect while also being a flyer. So this is a card you're going to want to attack somebody with first, deal 5 damage, and then throw it at the opponent for 7 more damage, meaning 12 damage minimum, unless you use that fire-breathing effect to stack even more power into that. Then we have the Skitterbeam Battalion. This thing is absolutely nutty in our deck. We can prototype it for 5, creating essentially 3 hasty trample constructs that all can be used to swing at our opponents if they are open, but more importantly can be used to automatically have high cost things to throw with our commander, and many of them are tokens we don't care about losing. Remember that Dowsing Device gives a creature XO, where X is the artifacts we control? Never forget that Skitterbeam Battalion does have trample, so there's plenty of instances where Skitterbeam Battalion is just going to get that land's power chunked onto it and then swing hard at somebody for massive damage before being sacrificed to deal either 5 or 9 damage. Remember, prototyped creatures keep the mana value of their prototyping, so it can either be a slew of 5 mana 2/2 constructs or a slew of 9 mana 4/4 constructs, depending on if you pay the 9 mana or the 5 mana for the prototype cost. So do bear in mind which side you choose will matter a lot. We also want to keep some of our important pieces on the board, so a Mirror Shield and a Champion's Helm are in here to add hexproof to our important game pieces, because honestly, losing our commander isn't the worst thing in the world, but we still want to have these ways to protect it, and they always count towards the affinity effect for us anyway, so it doesn't hurt anyways. Then we have a Reanimation and Recursion section, which is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting in this deck, beginning with, of course, Vat of Rebirth, one of my personal favorites. If an artifact or creature touches the graveyard, put an oil counter on it, pay 3 mana, tap it, and revive any creature from your graveyard at sorcery speed. Good card, 1 mana, doesn't hurt, and that 1 mana is already going to be paying for our commander anywho. Junk Diver is also fantastic. Whenever it dies, we can return any artifact from our graveyard to our hand. Scrap Trawler says that anytime any other artifact goes away, we can return an artifact from our graveyard to our hand that has lesser mana value. Mishra can give all the artifacts in our graveyard unearth, so while they will not be able to be used multiple times after this because they will be exiled afterwards, having unearth on all of them can lead us to having a Haymaker turn where we win the game, or at least eliminate 1 or 2 players. Scrap Welder lets us sack artifacts and get new artifacts out from the graveyard with his effect. Remember, Scrap Welder can sack an artifact and basically get a double trigger off of Scrap Trawler, sacking an artifact to revive a thing, and then letting Scrap Trawler revive a thing on top of that. Speaking of which, Duretti Scrap Savant is in here as well. He has a small draw engine or a looting engine attached to him, but his -2 is what he's in here for primarily. We can sack an artifact and then return any artifact from our graveyard to the battlefield, irrespective of cost. So Duretti is going to be doing a lot of work for what our deck is trying to be. But we are an artifact sacrificing deck, so we need more ways to sacrifice artifacts than just what our commander is doing. To facilitate that, we have these 3 sack outlets on top of the Thunderfold Gearhulk, and they are Tarian's Journal, which lets us sack an artifact to draw a card. We can also flip it to have a reanimation spell on a land if we need it. Ayara, Widower of the Realm, which lets us sacrifice artifacts to deal X damage to an opponent, and then gain X life, which is important in our deck because we are losing life to our commander's draw ability. Then, if it's late into the game, we can transform Ayara to get a card that will reanimate any artifact or creature from our graveyard all the time. And even though it exiles those cards at the end step, it doesn't matter because we can sacrifice those cards before they get exiled, effectively giving us the ability to go forward and harder in the deck without really having to sacrifice too much in terms of board presence. We're just going to be reusing cards in our graveyard over and over at no cost to us. Then we have Brea's Apprentice, which can sack an artifact to either give us Impulse Draw or give a creature 2/0 until end of turn. Primarily, though, it's also in here because it's an artifact creature that makes another colorless Thopter when it touches the board, discounting our commander by 2 on his own, which is incredibly good for what we are doing. But that's not all. We also need artifacts that benefit from being sacrificed. So here we have a sack for value section where every card is generating us some kind of advantage when artifacts touch the graveyard. Prized Statue will give us a treasure when it comes onto the board, effectively being ramp for multiple things. And also, if it gets destroyed or sacrificed, then we can go ahead and make another treasure. Mycosynth Wellspring is tutoring up any basic land while also giving us that land twice if it happens to be destroyed or sent to the graveyard in any way. Servo Schematic and Nimblewright Schematic are the same card. They just throw a construct token onto the board, both when they touch the board and when they are sacrificed or destroyed in any way. This gives us tons of ways to double up on discounting our commander's cost. Slagstone Refinery will replace any of the non-token artifacts we get rid of with Power Stone tokens so that we never have to worry about running out of mana for our commander's cost. Sly Requisitioner also will stack with those as well, as it makes all of our non-tokens get replaced by colorless servo creatures. This can effectively make our commander always cost 2 mana because no matter how many times we sacrifice non-token artifacts, we'll always be replacing them with 2 or 3 tokens. Speaking of which, Oni Colt Anvil, once per turn, can give us a 1/1 colorless construct if an artifact touches the graveyard, and it also can sacrifice an artifact in its own right to deal 1 damage to every opponent and gain us 1 life. It is a mini sack outlet on top of being able to stack with things like the Nimblewright Schematic and the Sly Requisitioner, giving us access to tons and tons and tons of token artifacts to replace all of the cards we are getting rid of. And remember, all those non-token artifacts are benefiting other things in our deck, as we have multiple cards with Improvise and Affinity and adding power based on artifacts we control. So that's the core of our deck. What else are we doing to keep this thing running? Our commander draws lots of cards, but we need more than just a commander draw engine to make a deck work. So let's get into that. So while our commander does draw us a lot of cards, and we do have ways to play him multiple times a turn by sacrificing him with things like Tarian's Journal and Ayara if we've got enough artifacts on the board to discount his cost, We don't want to rely exclusively on doing that. We need a strong draw engine to back him up on top of everything else. So let's begin with the first one, which is going to double as a very strong mana engine for our deck late in the game, Matsalanti the Great Door. This lets us draw a card and discard a card to loot through our deck, and also we can transform it at any point if we meet its transformation cost to add X mana of any color, where X is the number of permanent cards in our graveyard. Our deck only has 5 instants and 5 sorceries, so we are primarily made up of cards that will feed into this effect. So this is a house, and you should run it in more decks. It is dirt cheap, and it does more work than you think. Then we have Fanatical Offering, which lets us sacrifice a creature or an artifact to draw 2 cards, and then it makes a map token, replacing that on our board for our commander's effect. Reckoneer's Bargain also can sack an artifact creature to draw us 2 cards, but it also gains us life equal to that card's mana value, which will help offset our commander's mana cost. Mystic Forge allows us to play any spell that's an artifact from the top of our deck, of which our deck has 49, and we can pay 1 life to exile the top card of our library. Also, remember that with Mystic Forge, if we don't like the draw that's on top of our deck, or we're caught on a land or something, sometimes sacking the commander and getting his draw real quick will actually help power us through those dead hits. Also, because so many cards in our deck are either low cost or have improvise or affinity, we can have a pseudo storm turn with this, so be very careful if you start doing that. Your pods might not be super thrilled about it. Then we have Seize the Spoils, which allows us to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token by discarding a single card. Very simple, and in a higher budget version of the deck, we might actually run more versions of this effect, especially because they back up this next card, Treasure Map. This may not look like a draw card on the surface, but it will end up doing that for us very well. It lets us scry 1 and then put a landmark counter on it. Then after we get 3 landmark counters on it, we can flip it over into Treasure Cove, which lets us sacrifice treasures to draw a card. It also generates 3 treasures when we get that ability off, so we have 3 easy ways to draw cards, not counting treasures we've generated from other things like, say, Seize the Spoils, or the treasures you've generated from Prized Statue. Then there's Brass's Tunnel Grinder, which is a wonderful wheel. It enters the battlefield, discards any number of cards in our hand, and then we draw that many cards plus 1, which is already good for an artifact, but after that, if we have Descended, we put a Boar counter on it. If you get the 3rd Boar counter on Brass's Tunnel Grinder, then it will automatically flip. And remember, it's easy to get those Boar counters because all you have to do is have permanents touch the graveyard. Our deck only consists of 5 instants and sorceries, which means everything else in the deck that's not a land is a permanent spell or a permanent card that's going to be able to get thrown into the graveyard. Tikultin lets us discover X, where X is the mana value of any spell that we cast with it. So if we happen to cast something like, say, Mystic Forge, we can then discover into, say, Matsalanti the Great Door or Treasure Map, any of those. Tikultin is a house once it goes online, and people tend to not allow the card to go online because of how powerful it can be. So I highly recommend you drop this on the board and then get ready to have people look at you sideways the minute that it flips. But that's not the only way we're going to be drawing cards. We also have some cards that benefit from being sacrificed to draw us things. Ichor Wellspring draws us a card when it touches the board and when we sacrifice it. Wizard's Rocket, it enters the battlefield tapped and can be used for mana fixing, but we're never really going to use it for that because primarily we're just going to throw it to the graveyard with our commander to draw a card. Mephitic Drought allows us to lose a life and draw a card when it touches the board and when it enters the graveyard, just like Ichor Wellspring. Implement of Malice lets us sacrifice it to make a player discard a card in sorcery speed, and when it's put into a graveyard, we can draw a card. 9% of the time, 99% of the time, we're just going to be throwing this away with our commander. Chromatic Scar also lets us mana fix, but Chromatic Scar primarily says, when it's sent to the graveyard, draw a card. And Implement of Combustion also draws us a card anytime it touches the graveyard. It can also be sacrificed to deal 1 damage to a player, which I'm sure there's 1 in a billion niche scenarios where that particular effect is going to come in handy for you. But primarily, we're going to sack this with our sack outlets or with our commander, and then recur it up with other stuff later. Next, we have the all-important removal and interaction package. And as with most things in this deck, I have to start with our commander, because turns out Imsker can just aim his destructive abilities at an opponent and any target. He can get rid of planeswalkers, he can get rid of creatures, he can get rid of anything. So honestly, he's the first piece of interaction we are talking about. But afterwards, we gotta talk about Meteor Golem. Always Meteor Golem, and in this deck, more than any, because this blows up any non-land permanent, effectively removing all the weaknesses of being a Rakdos deck in terms of our different types of targets we can hit. But Meteor Golem also, importantly, costs 7 mana, which means our commander will burn somebody for 7 mana or deal 7 damage to someone when we hit them with it. Meteor Golem, you are a trooper, and you will always be loved on this channel. Spine of Ishat is also doing the same thing as Meteor Golem, but with one noted exception. The Spine, whenever it is sacrificed, will come back to your hand, meaning we can use this repeatedly with our commander so long as we have the mana to do so. The Spine is going to be a pain in other people's spines the longer we get to abuse it. Feed the Swarm and Chaos Warp give us non-artifact ways to remove various things from the board. Tithing Blade forces everybody to sack a creature, and then we can sack it with one of our things, and then recur it to make people repeatedly sack things as well. Consuming Corruption, Battle at the Bridge, and Tendrils of Corruption are all doing similar things in our deck. Starting with Consuming Corruption, we can deal X damage to any creature or planeswalker and then gain X life, where X is the amount of swamps we control. I've chosen these kinds of removal effects for our instant speed removal because we need to have more ways of generating life to protect ourselves from our own commander's ability. Battle at the Bridge does the same thing, but with Improvise. So long as we have a ton of artifacts, we can tap them and deal, say, 20 damage to a Llanowar Elf and gain 20 life, keeping us in the game for a long time. Tendrils of Corruption is just a less powerful Consuming Corruption. X damage to a creature and you gain X life, where X is the swamps you control. Then we have Herald of Anguish, which says that at the beginning of each end step, every opponent must discard a card. It has Improvise to lower its cost down, and we're allowed to sacrifice an artifact with it to make a creature get -2, -2. A wonderful removal spell and a sack outlet we have access to here. Noxious Gearhulk, for similar reasons as the Consuming Corruption, this blows up a creature while being an artifact creature in its own right with high mana costs for our commander to throw at people, while also having the benefit of giving us life when it blows up cards. Noxious Gearhulk is one of my favorites, and I tried so hard to make him viable in Pioneer, but Torrential Gearhulk, he is not. But that's fine. You are Black Meteor Golem as far as I am concerned, in most situations. Probably. And finally, we gotta talk about, at least for the primary version of the deck, our ramp and mana package. Most of that is just dropping any number of artifacts on the board due to our commander's ability to have affinity, which is insane, but that's not all we need access to. We also need land fetching and mana rocks and other standard stuff, so let's begin with Scampering Surveyor, a 4-mana creature that tutors any basic land to your field. It is just another version of Solemn Simulacrum without the ability to draw, but they are both in this deck as they are artifact creatures, so they are discounting our commander by 1 while also giving us a land every time we play them. Foundry Inspector can discount one of the 49 artifacts in our deck by 1, and Inspiring Statuary can discount the 24 non-artifact cards, or the, 24 non-artifact creatures, 34 non-artifact cards, as long as we are willing to tap artifacts into their effects. Fire Diamond, Charcoal Diamond are both serving their usual purpose as low-cost mana rocks. Honored Heirloom gives us a mana rock that lets us fuck with players' graveyards if we need. Mind Stone in this deck is awfully recurable and lets us draw a card. And then Arcane Signet and Ornithopter of Paradise are adding mana of any color, while also notably being 2-mana mana rocks, which is getting easier and easier to slot into these decks. But that's not all we are running here in terms of what the deck is doing. Normally, our land package is a series of fetching lands, a myriad landscape, and then some dual lands. But this time, we get to benefit from some extra spicy kinds of lands, artifact lands. Power Depot gives us a modular ability, so we can sack it and give a creature a 1/1 counter if we need, but notably it is an artifact land. Drossforge Bridge is a dual land that is an artifact land, and Scene of the Crime is an artifact land that lets us tap any creature we control to get mana of any color if we need it for the filter. We can also sack it to draw a card, as it is in fact a clue. This is going to be the first thing I got to talk about when we start talking about upgrades for the deck. Obviously, we're running 12 basic swamps and 7 basic mountains, higher on swamps because our removal spells require that. Our dual lands are Tainted Peak, Foreboding Ruins, Shadowblood Ridge, Command Tower, and Smoldering Marsh, as they all come into play untapped and do their jobs effectively. Our fetching lands are Terramorphic Expanse, Shire Terrace, Evolving Wilds, Promising Vein, Myriad Landscape, and Grixis Panorama, as they can fetch us any type of land that we need in our deck. And our utility lands are Pit of Offerings to give us an easy access to removing people's graveyards out of the game, and Buried Ruin because it allows us to recur artifacts that are otherwise hard to recur in our deck. And that does it for our primary deck. 35 lands, $15.61, 70 cents of that is our commander, and a whopping 49 artifact package makes this deck a mad powerhouse. But what would you say if you had a little bit more of a budget and you wanted to spend that on this deck? How would we go about that? Well, let's talk about that. Finally, let's talk upgrades. If you've got the budget, these should go in immediately. And the very first upgrade I would make to the deck is adding in more artifact lands. Our budget did not support it here, but Great Furnace, Vault of Whispers, Treasure Vault, and Darksteel Citadel are all ridiculously good includes in this deck, as they get to serve double duty of both being regular-ass lands and also discounting our commander. We also have Fomori Vault, which allows you to get a mini draw engine attached to a land, so long as you're willing to have lots of artifacts on the board, which is really easy for us to do. And Golden Guardian is another interesting kind of land in that we pay 4 mana for it and then automatically sack it to our commander's ability to get it flipped over into the Goldforge Garrison, which lets us get 2 mana of any color to our mana pool on its own, but also can create colorless golem tokens for us late in the game if we need something to dump mana into. After that, though, we'll go in most expensive. The One Ring would be a huge upgrade for the deck. A draw engine in and of itself that we can turn off at any point with our commander's ability, along with the ability to protect ourselves. It's fantastic, and Wizards needs to reprint this thing into the ground because $65 for a piece of cardboard is honestly stupid. We also have Sheoldred the Apocalypse, another contender for cards that need to be printed into the ground. When we draw a card, we gain 2 life, so it offsets our commander's ability entirely, and it also adds a little bit of burn, increasing the clock for our opponents. Karklan Ironworks lets us sacrifice artifacts to generate mana. Mycosynth Golem will give all of our artifacts that don't have affinity anyway, and Mycosynth Lattice will turn all of our non-artifacts into artifacts and make our lands basically always do what they need to do. Our commander will always cost 2 while the Lattice is on the board. Wormcoil Engine is also another great include because we can sack it to make tokens, and it is a bigly costing card. On top of the Wormcoil Engine, you can use Triplicate Titan for a similar effect, and we can have the Wormcoil Larva and Phyrexian Triniform all doing, again, very similar effects for what we are trying to go for. Goblin Welder gives us access to cards in our graveyard with no mana restriction, as does Anacreer the Traveler. Deadly Dispute is an easier way to generate treasures by drawing lots of cards, along with Unexpected Windfall and Big Score, and Combustible Gearhulk allows us to have a draw or burn engine attached to a creature that we're always going to be throwing at our commander for lots of damage. So just the card is nutty in this deck. Our cards usually have big costs anyway, so most people won't take the gamble and they'll just let us draw the 3 cards. But for the one person who does take that gamble, they might burn for like 15. Their Name is Death is a wonderful board wipe we can use in our deck because our non-artifact creatures dying, we don't care if our commander dies. We're going to just cast it again for 2 anyway. Chisgoria Forged Tyrant gives all the cards it impulse draws for you 5 a turn. That is, it gives them all affinity for artifacts. This thing is nuts, and it has affinity in and of itself, so it's great. Crime Novelist will supplement our mana for all the cards we are sacrificing. If you have Crime Novelist and Karkran Ironworks on the board, our commander only costs 1 mana for every time we use its effect, so we get to just burn somebody to death really quickly. And speaking of making people burn to death really quickly, Marionette Master is an easy include in decks like this, since the Marionette Master lets us burn people effectively for 4 every time an artifact touches the graveyard. And finally, Bolas's Citadel. Since it is an artifact and does give us the ability to dig through our decks very, very quickly, and since we have artifact lands, sometimes just dropping artifact lands off Bolas's Citadel doesn't hurt as much in our deck as it does in other decks. And with that said, that's all the deck upgrades that I can think of. In conclusion, Imskir Iron Eater is a fantastic commander that discounts himself very, very far, draws you tons of things, and has his win con stapled to his ass crack. Imskir is amazing, and I hope you enjoy this deck tech itself. $15 is not a lot to pay for a commander that's doing this much in terms of like all the other things that are in the deck as well. Hopefully the upgrades are enough to give you an idea of the different paths you might be able to take with the deck. And if you are playing this deck, if you already have been enjoying running him after the release of Modern Horizons 3, let me know in the comment section below so I can see what builds you're running with him. That all said, thank you all for watching these videos. I appreciate every one of you that's been here. The channel growth has been insane. The support has been insane. I love seeing every one of you in the comment section. If you are not a usual commenter, it does really help the channel out in the algorithm, and I'm not going to be obtuse about that. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sajit, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.